Okay, so my presentation is on Adorno's The Culture Industry and Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. And I'm going to be talking about the politicization of art and a little bit about what this implies. So, in Walter Benjamin's The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, he sets out to determine how a work of art remains significant given the rise of neo-capitalist modes of production and mechanical reproduction, and how the production of art has political significance. In the epigraph, he has a passage from Paul Valéry's The Conquest of Ubiquity. It says, "We must expect great innovation to transform the entire techniques of the art and thereby affecting artistic innovation itself, and perhaps even bring about an amazing change in our very notion of art." So, mechanical means of innovation has potential to bring about changes in the conception of what art is. Okay. Benjamin describes this notion of aura, which he defines as an art's presence in space and time, its unique existence at a place where it happens to be. This unique existence of the work of art determined the history to which it was subject throughout the times of its existence. So the aura is a quality that is present in an original work of art, but is not explicitly depicted. That might be some kind of ritualistic aspect or just merely the process of its production. The mechanical reproduction makes it difficult to distinguish the time and space in which the piece of art is created. Aura is absent in the mechanically reproduced copy. And with the absence of a work of art's aura is the absence of what Benjamin defines its authenticity. When a work of art can be reproduced with technological and mechanical percussion, its authenticity is given up. So the aura of a work of art gives it its authenticity. Benjamin believes that the absence of authenticity is not necessarily a bad thing. It allows the reproducible art to be readily available to the masses. And when art is available to the masses, it allows potential for new interpretation and meaning. So this absence of aura and authenticity cannot be reproduced. Benjamin writes, "For the first time in world history, mechanical reproduction emancipates the work of art from its parasitical dependence on ritual. The aura expresses some special feature of the object that one experiences in contemplating the object as an art object. The reproduced work of art is detached from its ritualistic experience that is gained from its contemplation. The ritualization of art, Benjamin believes, gives too much authority to tradition. Benjamin believes that art can be and should be freed from its. In The Origins of the Work of Art by Martin Heidegger, he writes, "What we have tried to treat as the most immediate reality of the work, its thingly substructure does not belong to the work in that way at all." So there's this phenomenological aspect present in art that is similar to Benjamin's concept of aura. But what's different from Heidegger to Benjamin is Heidegger emphasizes that art has a role in preserving the truth which is found in tradition and ritual. He writes, "Art is historical, and as historical, it is the preserving of truth in art." So the emphasis on tradition in Heidegger's writing contrasts with Benjamin's idea that art has its revolutionizing potential. And over here I spelled Heidegger wrong, but Heidegger is speculating that the essence of art is in its history. So Benjamin seems to emphasize that art has a potential to be emancipated from its parasitic dependence on ritual. He writes, distraction as provided by art presents a covert control of the extent to which new tasks have been soluble by a perception. And so, this is opposed to Heidegger's notion that art is a vessel of truth, or should reveal and unconceal an aspect of history. Benjamin believes that this frees art from its reliance on a aesthetic authority and mechanical reproduction, has replaced artistic contemplation with what he refers to as distraction. But this notion of distraction is not necessarily a bad thing. It allows the viewer to freely interpret the work accordingly given their own experiences. Benjamin concludes that the self-alienation has reached such a degree that it can experience its own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order, which is the situation of politics which fascism is rendering aesthetics. Communism responds by politicizing fascism. So the loss of aura leaves room for the politicization of art. Benjamin takes art as a revolutionary instrument now that it's been freed from its history. So the important question here that Benjamin is speculating is, does art play a role in the promotion of ideology? He gives several examples throughout the essay of this that reflect this aestheticization of politics. Specifically, he talks about futurism and the Manifesto of Futurism by Filippo Tommaso Martinetti. Futurism was intended to reject past traditions and celebrate machinery and industrialization. And it often promoted and glorified the necessity of war as a cure for the world. Futurism often utilized this rhetoric of cleanliness and extermination of filth, and it was incredibly influential to the fascist movements. On the right, we have Umberto Buconetti's Unique Forms of Continuity in Space, and it depicts this highly dynamic, mechanized demand that reflected an urge towards progress and industrialization. In contrast to that, Benjamin talks about the Dada movement, which was also a political response to the futurists and their rhetoric of cleanliness through the extermination of certain groups of people. And so we have Duchamp's The Fountain, which is what would be known as like uncleanly, and it challenged the orthodox notions of art and culture by transforming commonplace objects into works of art. And the Dada movement was meant as a revolt against the status quo. This leads into the discussion on Adorno, who seems to despise this notion of the status quo and believes that art should revolt against this. He writes, in the culture industry fuses the old and familiar with new quality. In all its branches, products which are tailored for consumption by the masses and which, to a greater extent, determines the nature of that consumption are manufactured more or less according to plan. So new market tendencies paved new ways for consumption. Um, he writes, the masses are the ideology of the culture industry, and that the culture industry adapts to the habits and of the masses, and the culture industry is manufactured instead of created. Adorno goes on to talk about commodity and consumption. He writes, the customer is not the king, as the culture industry would have liked us to believe, not its subject, but its object. Products and art are made for consumption, according to Adorno. And because the culture industry pervades every aspect of life, more than ever, commodities begin to consume the consumer. And Adorno fears that the commodification of art will favor profit over genuine artistic expression. And he establishes that art need not be beholden to any industry. Continuing on, the illusion of individuality, Adorno believes, serves to reinforce ideology insofar as the illusion is conjured up by the completely rectified and mediated that is the sanctuary from immediacy and life. The culture industry functions through its illusion of individuality. For example, the media is constructed to satisfy the needs of the individual, yet at the same time, the culture industry appears more and more unified. We take ourselves to be consumers, but in reality, we are the commodities. So Adorno believes that the culture industry plays a big part in perpetuating ideology. He writes, the most ambitious defense of the culture industry today celebrates its spirit, which might safely be called ideology as an ordering factor. In a supposedly chaotic world, it provides human beings with something like a standard for orientation, and that alone seems worthy of approval. So to say that the ideology of the culture industry is an ordering factor means that it strives for standardization. The culture industry plays a huge role in creating a marketable version of art. And so the consumption of art as a commodity leads to passivity and contentment. And mass-produced art is, in a sense, homogenized and standardized. And this cultural homogeny, Adorno believes, leads to a sort of conformity. Mass production allows items and trends to become popularized and commodified. In the second quote here, Adorno writes, the power of the culture industry's ideology is such that conformity has replaced consciousness. So Adorno fears that due to rapid commodification, that the artists will become sellouts and conform to the standardized forms of art pushed out by the culture industry. In the first quote he writes, however, what is defenders imagine is preserved by the culture industry is in fact more thoroughly destroyed by it. So Adorno is arguing that the culture industry has now been preserved more than it has been created or made. A good example of mass media and the culture industry is reflected in the movement of the situationalists who sought to create new object relations between commodity and the consumer. Since the commodification of art is so prevalent, it leads to the creation of mass culture and its politicization. The situationalists, like Adorno, saw the problem that commodities were consuming the consumer, and individuals were having their own thoughts replaced by those introduced by the mass media and the culture industry. So they used this method of deterrent, which was turning the media culture or capitalist system against itself by a subversive means, which was often through um, the parodying of popular art items like comic book strips. On the right, we have George Duchamel's Scenes de la Vie Future, where a woman from a comic book strip is expressing how her thoughts or consciousness have been affected by the prevalence of the culture industry. So, to conclude, Benjamin and Adorno, both their essays are a response to the new modes of production in capitalism and the new modes of consumption, the new means of consumption. Um, Adorno writes about Benjamin by saying the culture industry is defined by the fact that it conserves the decaying aura as a misty fog. So the culture industry maintains this facade of authenticity, and it preserves what is no longer there. Now, I have on the second bullet that it says Adorno favors tradition in art and Benjamin not so much. I meant this to say that Adorno favors an artistic contemplation as opposed to Benjamin's notion of distraction. Benjamin is more optimistic towards new modes of consumption, allowing art to become more accessible, whereas Adorno is more pessimistic towards these new modes of production and believes that mechanical reproduction is creating more passive consumers. Adorno believes that mass culture is detrimental to artistic progress, whereas Benjamin, on the other hand, would find no problem in this, and that the significance of art lies in its political potentials. So, in Benjamin, Adorno, and even Heidegger essays, they are writing from a more dialectic and historical approach. Now, I'm proceeding with what little I know about Hegelian dialectics, but it supposes that art is a process of unfolding towards the realization of an absolute. And the Hegelian notion of the end of history will denote the finalization of the progress towards this absolute, whereas the dialectic materialism proposed by Marx is this flipping of the Hegelian dialectic, where conditions of people are shaped by their material conditions. So the absolute would denote the end of a social cultural evolution. And in Benjamin and Adorno, they speculate on how the loss of ritual compacted with capitalist consumer tendencies might signal an end for. I'll talk more about dialectics in the end of this presentation, but to continue, Adorno's ideal of art that he lays out in his work, The Aesthetic Theory, which the truth content of artwork is infused with its critical content. And the unity of the history of art is the dialectical figure of determinate negation. So, similar to Heidegger, Adorno embraces the notion that art should embody a type of truth content. But that truth content is different from Heidegger's notion that it should preserve tradition. Art for Adorno should be subversive, authentic, and intellectually engaging. And this notion of critical content, art has a responsibility for social commentary. Adorno believes that art, which carries an ideology, must be critical of itself and pursue its own antagonism, i.e., its determinate negation. In aesthetic theory, Adorno talks about Samuel Beckett's Endgame, which is a play where nothing really happens. He writes, "The key to contemporary anti-art with Beckett at its pinnacle is perhaps the idea of concretizing this negation, of culling aesthetic meaning from the radical negation of metaphysical meaning." Um, so in this play that nothing happens, all the events are pretty mundane, and the dialogue is often repetitive, but Adorno finds this to be significant because the beauty or aesthetic meaning must be picked out from this non-being, or becoming, the radical negation of metaphysical meaning. And so for Adorno, Beckett plays are an exemplary of a notion of the determinate negation in which art is critical of itself and its own societal conditions. So this notion of the end game of art, so to say, returns us back to the beginning of the semester, where we read Arthur C. Danto's The End of Art, a Philosophical Defense, where Danto uses a similar dialectic approach in his essay outlining the progression of art from Plato's mimetic theory towards what he now considers the end of art, signified through Andy Warhol's Brillo boxes. So for Danto, we've reached the end of art when it becomes that there are no necessary and sufficient conditions for art. Art is finally freed from its historical constraints, and the freedom to transform the commonplace object into a work of art is its end. For Andy Warhol and the Brillo boxes, art no longer is mimetic. Rather, the mimetic theory was just a mode of presentation. Warhol and Beckett have shown that the mimetic theory was a means, not an end. And in Samuel Beckett's Endgame, I should mention that it takes place in this post-apocalyptic setting where all the actions that the actors perform are relatively mundane, but at the same time, they're fairly absurd. And so it's this sort of transfiguration of the commonplace. So art has kind of returned full circle in that it's mimetic, but at the same time, it's not, which is what Danto in his End of Art discusses. So the end of art doesn't indicate that that there is no good art to come. Rather, it is to say that art has finally reached its goal, or telos, so to say. And with that, I have also reached my telos, and that's the end of my presentation.